Coming home from a deployment to find an unauthorized swimming pool in your backyard sounds like a bad joke, but that's exactly what happened to me. I'm James, a retired Marine Corps veteran, and this is the story of how my homeowners association decided to beautify my property while I was serving overseas, and how they learned the hard way that you don't mess with a Marine's home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I've lived in Maple Ridge Estates for nearly a decade now. It's one of those picturesque developments nestled in the outskirts of Charlotte, North Carolina, where mature oak trees line the streets and American flags flutter proudly from front porches. When I bought my house here in 2014, it was perfect. A colonial-style home with 2 acres of land backing up to a protected woodland area. The extensive backyard was what sold me on it. After years of living in cramped military housing and deployment zones, having my own piece of land meant everything. The property came with something special too. A natural spring-fed pond near the back of the lot. It wasn't huge, maybe 30 feet across, but it was beautiful. Local wildlife would visit, and I'd often spend my evenings sitting on my back deck watching deer come to drink or herons fishing in the shallow waters. That pond became my sanctuary, especially after retiring from active duty. There's something therapeutic about having your own little slice of nature. I'll admit I wasn't around much at first. Between my final tours and training rotations, the house sat empty for months at a time. But I kept up with the maintenance through a property management company, paid my HOA dues on time, and never had any issues. My neighbors were mostly friendly, though I didn't know many of them well. Most seemed to respect that I liked my privacy, and I respected theirs in return. Everything changed during my last deployment. I had 6 months left before retirement, and I was stationed in the Middle East as a security consultant for a military contractor. The money was good, and it would help pad my retirement fund. Before leaving, I made all the usual arrangements: automatic bill payments, lawn service scheduled, and my trusted property manager keeping an eye on things. What I didn't expect was for the HOA to completely overstep their bounds while I was gone. The Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association had always been relatively reasonable, at least compared to the horror stories I'd heard from other veterans. Sure, they had their rules about lawn maintenance and exterior paint colors, but nothing too extreme. The board consisted of 5 members, led by a woman named Patricia Wellington. Everyone called her Trish, who had moved in about 2 years ago and quickly worked her way up to HOA president. I'd only met Trish once, at a mandatory HOA, a meeting before my deployment. She had this way of talking that reminded me of some of the more ambitious officers I'd served under, always speaking about community vision and property values with an intensity that seemed excessive for someone managing a suburban neighborhood. During that meeting, she'd presented plans for community enhancement projects that would make our development the crown jewel of Charlotte's suburbs. I remember thinking it sounded expensive, but since I was leaving for deployment soon, I didn't pay much attention. That was my first mistake. Looking back, I should have noticed the red flags, the way she kept talking about unused spaces in the neighborhood, her comments about how some properties weren't living up to their full potential, the subtle hints about how my natural pond could be so much more. But when you're preparing for deployment, your mind is focused on more immediate concerns. Making sure your will is updated, getting your affairs in order, saying goodbye to loved ones. You don't expect to come home and find that your peaceful backyard pond has been transformed into a full-sized community swimming pool. But that's exactly what happened, and what followed was a battle that would make some of my military operations look simple in comparison. My life at Maple Ridge had fallen into a comfortable routine before that final deployment. Every morning I'd wake up at 500. Old habits die hard when you've spent 20 years in the Corps. I'd start with a 5-mile run through the neighborhood, usually crossing paths with Jim, another veteran who lived a few streets over. He'd served in the army, and we had this unspoken agreement to pretend we didn't see each other's service branch stickers on our cars. Some rivalries never die, but there's always respect. The natural pond in my backyard had become more than just a water feature. It was part of my therapy. My VA counselor had suggested finding a peaceful spot for meditation, and that pond fit the bill perfectly. I'd installed a small wooden dock that extended about 10 feet over the water, just big enough for a chair and a small table. Most mornings after my run, I'd sit out there with my coffee, watching the sun rise over the tree line while the morning mist rolled off the water. Wildlife had made themselves at home too. A family of wood ducks had taken up residence, and I'd named them all, much to the amusement of my sister Sarah when she visited. The mother duck was General Quackers. Hey, military humor isn't known for being sophisticated. And her ducklings were the enlisted ranks. I'd even caught myself giving them morning briefings sometimes, telling them about the day's weather forecast, or warning them about the blue heron that liked to fish in the deeper end. The pond wasn't just therapeutic for me. Local kids would sometimes stop by with their parents to feed the ducks or look for turtles. I'd installed a small fence and gate for safety, and I had strict rules. No unsupervised children, no swimming. The pond was spring-fed and quite deep in spots, and always asked permission first. The parents appreciated having a safe place for their kids to learn about nature, and I enjoyed sharing my little sanctuary with respectful visitors. My neighbor to the right, Mrs. Chen, was particularly fond of the pond. She was in her 70s and had lived in the neighborhood since it was built. Every evening she'd sit on her back porch with her cat, Mr. Whiskers, and we'd exchange waves. Sometimes she'd bring over her homemade dumplings, claiming she'd made too many, but I knew better. She just worried that I wasn't eating well enough. In return, I'd help her with heavy lifting or home repairs. It was the kind of neighborly relationship you don't find much anymore. The left side of my property bordered an empty lot that the HOA maintained as a green space. It was mostly wild grassland with a few young trees. Nothing special, but it created a nice buffer between properties. Trish had mentioned several times at HOA meetings that she had big plans for that space, but most residents seemed content with it as it was. The natural look fit well with my pond and helped create that peaceful atmosphere I'd worked so hard to maintain. I'd invested considerable time and money into making my property both beautiful and functional. The backyard was terraced, with native plants and stone retaining walls leading down to the pond. I'd installed subtle lighting that highlighted the landscaping at night without disturbing the wildlife. A gravel path wound through the garden, past a small vegetable patch where I grew tomatoes and herbs. Everything was designed to work with the natural contours of the land, preserving the spring that fed the pond while preventing erosion. The HOA had actually given me an award the previous year for most natural landscape design. Ironic, considering what they would later do to it. But back then, my property was often used as an example of how to maintain a beautiful yard without resorting to chemical-heavy lawns or artificial features. Several neighbors had even asked for advice on creating their own wildlife-friendly gardens. Even my garage had become something of a neighborhood feature. I'd converted half of it into a workshop where I restored old furniture, another hobby my counselor had suggested for keeping my hands and mind occupied. Neighbors would bring me their family heirlooms to repair, and I'd often find myself teaching impromptu woodworking lessons to interested kids or adults. It was a good life, peaceful and productive, exactly what I'd hoped for when I bought the place. If only I'd known how quickly it could all change. The first signs that something was wrong came about 3 months before my deployment. I was working in my garage one Saturday afternoon, restoring an antique rocking chair for Mrs. Chen, when Trish and two other HOA board members showed up unannounced. They were carrying tablets and measuring tools, which immediately set off my internal alarm bells. In the military, you learn quickly that people with measuring tools usually mean changes are coming. "James!" Trish's voice had that artificial sweetness that reminded me of expired MRE candy. "We're doing a property assessment for our community enhancement initiative. Do you have a few minutes?" Before I could even put down my sandpaper, they were already walking around to my backyard. I followed, trying to suppress the irritation at the intrusion. 20 years of military discipline helps you keep a straight face, even when you want to tell someone exactly where they can stick their community enhancement initiative. They spent the next hour surveying my backyard, taking measurements and photos. Trish kept making comments that should have worried me more than they did at the time. "This space has so much potential," she said, standing near my pond. "The elevation changes are perfect for what we're planning." When I asked what exactly they were planning, she just smiled and said it was all part of the big reveal at the next HOA meeting. Mrs. Chen was out on her porch during their visit, and I caught her shaking her head with a concerned look. Later, that evening, she brought over her dumplings, her universal signal for when she had something important to tell me. "Be careful with that woman," she said, her accent thickening with worry. "Last month she tried to tell me my koi pond was a mosquito hazard. When I refused to fill it in, suddenly my annual garden competition scores dropped for the first time in 15 years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I should have paid more attention to Mrs. Chen's warning. She'd lived here long enough to see 3 HOA presidents come and go, and she had a sixth sense for trouble. But I was distracted with preparation for my upcoming deployment. Between getting my affairs in order and completing my pre-deployment training, the HOA's suspicious behavior seemed like a minor concern. A week later, I received an official-looking envelope from the HOA. Inside was a notice about a community waterfront enhancement project and a survey asking homeowners to rate their interest in various aquatic amenities. The options included things like a community pool, a splash pad for kids, and a modern water feature. At the bottom was a note stating that homeowners who didn't respond would be counted as supporting the initiative. I immediately filled out the survey, marking my strong opposition to any changes near my property. I also attached a letter explicitly stating that I did not give permission for any modifications to my land or the natural spring that fed my pond. I delivered it to the HOA office personally and requested a receipt, another habit from military life. Always get everything in writing. The HOA meeting that followed was tense. Trish presented her grand vision for Maple Ridge Estates, complete with architectural renderings and a slick video presentation. Most of it seemed reasonable enough. Upgrading the playground equipment, adding some benches along the walking trails. But then she got to the centerpiece of her plan, a resort-style community pool complex that would unite the neighborhood. The location of this proposed pool was conspicuously vague in her presentation. When Jim, my Army veteran neighbor, asked about specific locations being considered, Trish smoothly changed the subject to the potential increase in property values. Several other residents raised concerns about costs and maintenance, but Trish assured everyone that the HOA had secured funding and that dues would only see a minimal increase. After the meeting, I pulled Trish aside and expressed my concerns about any changes that might affect my pond's spring system. She dismissed my worries with a wave of her hand. "Oh, James, you military types are always so protective of your territory. But sometimes we have to think about the greater good of the community. Besides, you'll be deployed soon. Wouldn't It'd be nice to come back to some improvements. Something about the way she said that made my combat instincts tingle. In the Marines, we call it tactical awareness, that gut feeling when something's not right. But with only 2 weeks left before deployment, I had to trust that the proper channels would protect my property rights. I made copies of all my documentation, including my explicit refusal for any modifications to my property, and left them with both my property manager and my sister Sarah. Looking back, I should have done more. But who would have thought that an HOA would dare to make major modifications to someone's property while they were serving their country overseas? I was about to learn that some people see a deployed service member not as someone to support, but as an opportunity to exploit. The last week before my deployment was a blur of activity. Between final preparations and trying to get my property in order, I barely had time to notice Trish's increasingly frequent appearances in my neighborhood. But looking back, the signs of her true nature were becoming clearer each day, like a target emerging from the morning mist on the shooting range. It started with her casual visits to my neighbors. Mrs. Chen reported that Trish had been going door to door with what she called a community vision petition. The petition, as it turned out, was cleverly worded to give the HOA board broad authority to implement community improvements as deemed necessary for the enhancement of property values. Several of my neighbors, particularly the newer residents, had signed it without fully understanding its implications. Jim, my army neighbor, came by one evening as I was securing my workshop. He'd refused to sign Trish's petition, and her reaction had been telling. "She got this look in her eyes," he said, leaning against my workbench, like a drill sergeant who just found out a recruit questioned their authority. Then she started talking about how her husband was a contractor for the military, so she understands the veteran perspective, as if that gives her some kind of special insight into what we want for our properties. The conversation with Jim was interrupted by the sound of voices from my backyard. We walked out to find Trish, leading what appeared to be a professional landscaping team around my pond. They were taking soil samples and marking various spots with small flags. The audacity of entering my property without permission sent a familiar surge of controlled anger through my system, the kind you learn to manage after years of military service. "Trish," I called out, keeping my voice level but firm, "I don't recall giving permission for anyone to be on my property." The landscaping team looked uncomfortable, but Trish merely smiled, that politician's smile of hers. "Oh, James, we're just doing some preliminary environmental surveys. It's required for any community improvements," she said, waving a document that looked official, but that she conveniently didn't offer to show me. "Besides, the HOA bylaws give us access for assessment purposes. Not without proper notice, and certainly not for unauthorized modifications," I countered, remembering the explicit terms in my HOA agreement. "I'm deploying in a week, and I want it on record that I do not authorize any changes to my property." During my absence, Trish's smile faltered for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. "Now, James, I know change can be difficult, especially for people with your background, but you have to understand that progress is inevitable. The community pool project has already gained significant support, a project I explicitly opposed. In writing, I reminded her, the landscaping team was already packing up their equipment, clearly wanting no part in this confrontation. Smart civilians. "Yes, well, sometimes the majority must decide what's best for everyone," she replied, her tone deliberately patronizing. "We can't let one person's attachment to an outdated feature hold back the entire community's development." Jim, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "That outdated feature is a natural spring-fed pond on private property, Mom. And last I checked, this was still America, where property rights mean something." Trish's expression hardened. "Of course they do, but so do community standards and property values. Perhaps when you return from your deployment, James, you'll see that we've made improvements you never even knew you wanted. The threat was subtle but clear. As she and her team left, Jim let out a low whistle. She's going to be trouble, brother. I've seen that type before. Thinks she's untouchable because she's got a little authority. I spent that evening making additional copies of all my property documentation and sending them to my lawyer. I also installed security cameras around the property, high-end ones that could be monitored remotely through my phone. It wasn't much, but it was the best I could do on short notice. The day before I left, Mrs. Chen came over with more dumplings and a worried expression. "In my country," she said softly, "we have a saying, the moth that flies closest to the flame is the first to burn. That woman, she flies too close. But be careful, James. Sometimes when moths burn, they take others with them." As I packed my bags that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving my home vulnerable to more than just the usual deployment concerns. In the Marines, we're trained to secure our position before moving out. But how do you secure your property against someone who operates behind a shield of bureaucratic authority and false legitimacy? I wouldn't know the answer to that question until months later, when I returned to find my peaceful sanctuary transformed into a chlorinated nightmare. My deployment started like any other. Long flights, endless briefings, and the familiar adjustment to life in a combat zone. I'd arranged for my property manager, Steve, to check on the house weekly and send me updates. He was ex-military himself, having served in the Air Force. Nobody's perfect, and I trusted him to keep an eye on things. The first sign that something was wrong came about 2 weeks into my deployment. Steve's weekly email mentioned that the HOA had posted notices throughout the neighborhood about an emergency board meeting to discuss critical infrastructure improvements. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 10 a.m., a time when most residents would be at work. Classic tactical maneuver. If you want to push something through without opposition, strike when your opponent's defenses are down. I immediately emailed Trish, copying the entire HOA board, my property manager, and my lawyer. The email was clear and direct, military style. I officially objected to any meetings regarding property modifications being held, while a significant number of residents, including an actively deployed service member, couldn't attend. I cited the Service Members Civil Relief Act, SCRA, and reminded them of my previous written objections. Trish's response came within hours, dripping with false concern. "Dear James, while we appreciate your service to our country, the needs of the community cannot be put on hold indefinitely. Rest assured that all proper procedures are being followed. We have carefully reviewed the SCRA and consulted with our legal team. The planned improvements fall well within our authority as outlined in the HOA bylaws." The meeting went ahead as planned. Steve attended on my behalf, but as a non-resident, he wasn't allowed to vote or raise objections. According to his report, the whole thing felt orchestrated. Trish presented updated architectural plans that had supposedly been approved by relevant authorities. When one resident asked about the specific location of the proposed pool, the response was vague. The final location will be determined based on technical assessments and community needs. Over the next few weeks, the power shift became more apparent. New notices started appearing, announcing preparatory work for the community enhancement project. Heavy equipment was moved into the empty lot next to my property. Mrs. Chen sent me photos of surveying teams walking around with sophisticated equipment, taking measurements and soil samples. Jim tried to intervene, questioning the legality of making major changes without full community involvement. His reward was a series of violation notices for everything from unauthorized garden fixtures to non-compliant mailbox height. Message received, oppose the board. face the consequences. The situation escalated when Steve reported that workers had started removing sections of my fence, the one protecting my pond. He confronted them with my written prohibition of any modifications to my property, but they produced HOA paperwork authorizing the work. When he called the police, they deemed it a civil matter and refused to intervene. I was stuck in a combat zone, watching through security camera feeds as my property was gradually invaded. The cameras caught Trish making regular visits, always, with different contractors or board members, pointing and planning like a general orchestrating an assault. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, protecting American interests overseas, while my own property rights were under attack back home. My sister Sarah began making daily visits to the property, documenting everything. She reported that the HOA had started holding informational sessions about the new community pool complex. The renderings now clearly showed a large pool facility situated exactly where my pond was, though they were careful to never explicitly state this in any written materials. The most infuriating part was how Trish was manipulating the narrative. She'd organized a community support our troops event, complete with banners and photos of service members, including one of me that she'd somehow obtained. The message was clear: oppose the pool project, and you're opposing someone who's serving their country. It was psychological warfare, HOA style. My lawyer advised that while we had grounds for legal action, the HOA was carefully staying just within technical legal boundaries. They were exploiting every loophole they could find, counting on my deployment, limiting my ability to fight back effectively. By the third month of my deployment, the power dynamic had shifted completely. The HOA, under Trish's leadership, had effectively seized control of the narrative and the process. They had the paperwork, the contractors, and most importantly, the advantage of being physically present while I was thousands of miles away. What they didn't count on was that 20 years in the Marines teaches you a lot about strategic patience and tactical response. They might have won the initial skirmish, but I was already planning my counterattack. Sometimes the best strategy is to let your opponent think they've won. Right up until the moment you spring your trap, the flight home from deployment always feels longer than the flight out. Maybe it's the anticipation, or maybe it's knowing that instead of the structured chaos of a combat zone, you're heading back to whatever chaos awaits at home. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found when my taxi turned onto Maple Ridge Drive at 2100 hours that Friday night. The first thing I noticed was the lighting. Harsh fluorescent pools of white light where my subtle landscape lighting used to be. As we got closer to my house, I could hear splashing and laughter. My security cameras hadn't shown this angle of the property, and now I understood why Trish's people had accidentally damaged the rear cameras during their preliminary work. I stepped out of the taxi, my deployment bag heavy on my shoulder, and just stood there trying to process what I was seeing. My entire backyard had been transformed. The natural pond, my peaceful sanctuary home to General Quackers and her troops, was gone. In its place was a massive concrete pool complex, complete with a water slide and what looked like a small clubhouse. The terraced landscaping had been leveled, the native plants replaced with generic poolside vegetation. My blood ran cold when I saw the sign, Maple Ridge Estates Community Pool, private property of the HOA. The pool was full of people. At 9 o'clock at night, families I'd never seen before splashing around in what used to be my private property. Music was playing from speakers mounted on the clubhouse walls. The whole scene was lit up like a stadium, light pollution drowning out the stars I used to watch from my dock. "Sir?" The taxi driver's voice snapped me back to reality. I paid him, added a generous tip for patience, and started walking toward what used to be my backyard. A teenage lifeguard in a chair I hadn't noticed before called out, "Sorry, sir, pool's closing in 15 minutes. I live here." I replied, my voice carrying that calm intensity that Marines develop when they're about to engage a target. "This is my property." The kid looked confused. "Oh, you must be new to the neighborhood. The pool is for all residents, but you need to get your access card from the HOA office. They're open Monday through—" "No, son, you don't understand. This is my property, my house, my land. My pond used to be right where you're sitting." The confusion on his face turned to concern. He reached for a radio clipped to his chair. Before he could use it, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "James, you're back early. We weren't expecting you until next week." Trish's voice had that same artificial sweetness, but now it carried a note of surprise, maybe even worry. She was wearing a designer sundress, looking like she'd stepped out of a real estate magazine. I turned slowly, keeping my breathing steady, just like I'd learned in combat training. "What have you done to my property?" "Your property? Oh, James, there seems to be some confusion. This is a community facility now. Everything was properly approved and documented. We sent you all the notices." She reached into a nearby tote bag, probably for some carefully prepared paperwork. "Where are my ducks?" The question seemed to throw her off guard. It wasn't what she was expecting. "The wildlife was humanely relocated," she said, regaining her composure. "Really, James, this is so much better for the community. Look how many families are enjoying this space. Your old pond was just collecting mosquitoes and taking up valuable real estate." That's when I noticed Mrs. Chen standing on her back porch, watching. She had tears in her eyes. Jim was there too, having heard the commotion. He was already walking over, phone in hand. "You had no right," I said, my voice deadly quiet. "I explicitly denied permission for any modifications to my property. I have it in writing, multiple copies, legally witnessed." Trish's smile turned condescending. "The HOA board has full authority to make improvements for the common good. It's in the bylaws. Besides, all the proper permits were obtained. The construction is completely legal and up to code. Ma'am, I just spent 6 months in a combat zone defending people's rights, including property rights. I strongly suggest you produce documentation proving you had the authority to destroy my property and build this water park." "Are you threatening me?" Her voice carried a hint of triumph, like she'd been waiting for this moment. "Because I should warn you, we have security cameras." She gestured to several cameras mounted on the clubhouse. "No, ma'am. I'm making you a promise, a Marine Corps promise. You're going to learn exactly what happens when you mess with the wrong veteran's property." The remaining families in the pool were hurriedly gathering their things, sensing the tension. The lifeguard was still radioing someone, probably HOA security. But I didn't care. I'd faced down insurgents and survived firefights. Some power drunk HOA president didn't scare me. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures and videos, documenting everything. This wasn't just about my property anymore. This was about right and wrong, about standing up to bullies who think they can take advantage of deployed service members. The battle for Maple Ridge Estates was about to begin. The following morning, I received an urgent notice to attend an emergency HOA board meeting. The timing was convenient for them, 0900 hours on a Saturday, less than 12 hours after my return. They probably hoped the jet lag would work in their favor. They didn't know that Marines operate on mission time, not clock time. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in business casual, but wearing my combat boots. A small psychological tactic. They're comfortable, but they also send a message. The meeting was held in the newly constructed clubhouse, right next to my former pond. The irony wasn't lost on me. The room was already half full. I recognized most of the faces. Concerned neighbors, a few property managers, and what appeared to be the HOA's legal counsel, judging by his suit and the stack of documents in front of him. Jim was there too, sitting in the back, arms crossed. He gave me a slight nod, the universal veteran signal for "I've got your six." Trish entered exactly at 9 a.m., flanked by the other board members. She was wearing a crisp business suit this time, projecting authority. The transformation from last night's casual pool supervisor to corporate executive was impressive. I'd seen less dramatic, quick changes during military operations. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice carrying that practiced tone of concerned leadership. "We're here to address some concerns that have been raised about our new community pool facility. First, I want to welcome back James Anderson from his deployment. Thank you for your service." The way she emphasized service made it sound like a liability rather than an honor. Classic manipulation tactic. Acknowledge the opponent's strength, while subtly undermining it. "Now, I understand there's some confusion about the pool project. Let me be clear. Everything was done according to proper procedures." She nodded to the lawyer, who began distributing packets of documents. "What you're receiving is a complete timeline of the project, including all permits, approvals, and community notifications." I flipped through the packet. It was impressively thorough. Permits from the city, environmental impact studies, even photos documenting the construction process. But something felt off about the dates. "As you can see," Trish continued, "the project was approved by a majority vote during our emergency session in March. All residents were notified, including our deployed service members." She paused, looking directly at me. "We take our responsibilities to the community very seriously, James. This project represents a significant investment in our neighborhood's future." I raised my hand, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served me well in countless high-pressure situations. "Ma'am, I'd like to address several points." "Of course," she smiled, but her eyes were calculating. "Though I should remind everyone that according to HOA bylaws, residents must submit questions in writing 5 business days before any meeting." "I believe we can make an exception," I replied, "considering I just discovered my private property has been converted into a public pool without my consent." "Your consent wasn't required," she countered smoothly. "Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws grants the board authority to implement community improvements when approved by a majority vote. The vote was 22 in favor, 3 against, with the remaining properties counted as abstaining per our voting procedures." "Interesting math," I said, keeping my voice level, "especially since that emergency session was held at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, when most residents were at work, and the notices were sent out just 48 hours before the meeting. All legally compliant with HOA regulations," the lawyer interjected. "The minimum notice period is 48 hours for emergency sessions." And the emergency was what? Exactly. A sudden critical shortage of swimming pools in Charlotte? A few nervous laughs from the audience. Trish's smile tightened. The emergency was a time-sensitive opportunity. We had contractors willing to begin work immediately at a significantly reduced rate. Waiting would have cost the community an additional $50,000. So you rushed through a vote while I was deployed, ignored my written objections, and destroyed my property to save money. "Your property?" Trish's voice took on a condescending tone. "James, this is community property now. The HOA purchased the rights to this section of your lot through proper legal channels. The documentation is all there in your packet, including the fair market value compensation that was deposited into your account." I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. "You mean this $5,000 deposit marked HOA landscaping compensation that I never authorized?" That amount was determined by independent appraisers as fair compensation for the affected portion of your property. Your deployment status doesn't exempt you from HOA decisions, James. We bent over backward to accommodate you, but the community's needs must come first." The room had grown tense. I could see some neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps realizing for the first time how easily their own property rights could be violated under the right bureaucratic circumstances. "One last question," I said, standing up. Slowly. "Did you get permission from the Army Corps of Engineers before modifying a natural spring watershed?" The slight widening of the lawyer's eyes told me everything I needed to know. Trish's perfect mask slipped for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. "All necessary permits were obtained from the city planning office." "That's not what I asked," I replied, gathering my documents. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer and the Corps of Engineers, and possibly the EPA, since I'm curious about what happened to the protected species of wood ducks that were nesting in my pond." As I walked out, I heard Trish calling the meeting back to order, trying to regain control of the narrative. But the damage was done. Sometimes the best way to counter an enemy's position is to expose the flaws in their foundation. The next few weeks were like a prolonged siege warfare. Trish and the HOA board escalated their offensive, clearly hoping to wear me down before I could mount an effective defense. It started with a series of violation notices appearing on my door. Apparently, my combat boots by the front door were unsightly personal items. My American flag was mounted non-regulation height, and my garden hose was coiled counter to approved HOA standards. Each violation came with a fine, naturally. When I refused to pay them, citing their illegitimacy, Trish moved to phase 2 of her assault. The pool hours were extended, with evening swim sessions running until 2300 hours. The exterior lighting, already bright enough to guide aircraft, was upgraded to what they called enhanced security lighting. My bedroom now looked like it was under perpetual daylight. The noise was constant. They installed a PA system for safety announcements, which somehow needed testing every few hours. The water slide, positioned perfectly to maximize echo off my house's walls, ran continuously. The splash pad they'd added had a timer malfunction that caused it to run at random intervals throughout the night. When I complained, Trish suggested I invest in better windows or play white noise to help with sleep. Mrs. Chen was suffering too. The increased humidity from the pool was affecting her prized orchids, and the chlorine fumes were aggravating her asthma. When she tried to address this at an HOA meeting, she was curtly informed that if she had health concerns about community improvements, perhaps she should consider relocating to a more suitable environment. The final straw came when I discovered they'd rerouted my property's drainage system to accommodate the pool complex. During the first heavy rain, my garage flooded. The water damage was extensive, destroying several pieces of furniture I'd been restoring, including Mrs. Chen's antique rocking chair. The HOA's response? A form letter stating that homeowners are responsible for maintaining proper drainage on their properties. Jim, who'd been documenting everything, brought over some interesting information he'd uncovered. "You're not going to believe this," he said, spreading papers across my kitchen table one evening. "Remember that significantly reduced rate they got from the contractors? Turns out the construction company is owned by Trish's brother-in-law." The plot thickened further when Sarah, who works in real estate, did some digging into property records. The independent appraisers who'd valued my pond at $5,000 were from a company that had worked exclusively with Trish's former employer, a development corporation known for aggressive property acquisition tactics. The community was starting to divide into factions. Some neighbors, seeing what had happened to my property, were beginning to question their own vulnerability. Others, swayed by Trish's promises of increased property values and resort-style amenities, became increasingly hostile toward anyone who raised concerns. The pool itself was becoming a source of problems. Without proper watershed management, the natural spring that had fed my pond was causing issues with the pool's foundation. Small cracks were appearing in the concrete, and the water level needed constant adjustment. But rather than address the underlying issue, the HOA simply increased their maintenance budget, and by extension, everyone's dues. One morning, I found survey stakes in the empty lot on the other side of my property. When I asked about them at the next HOA meeting, Trish unveiled Phase 2 of her community enhancement plan, a tennis complex with evening lighting to match our beautiful pool facility. The message was clear. Either I fell in line or the siege would continue. The psychological warfare escalated too. Trish organized a series of community appreciation events at the pool, making sure to invite local media. The story she spun was perfectly crafted, a progressive HOA creating family-friendly spaces, opposed by a difficult resident who couldn't adapt to positive changes. She never mentioned my military service now. That angle hadn't worked out as she'd planned. My security cameras caught HOA board members conducting late-night inspections of my property, meticulously documenting every possible violation. They'd shine flashlights through my windows, claiming they were checking for unauthorized modifications. When I installed privacy film on the windows, I received a violation notice for unapproved window treatments. The financial pressure was mounting. Between the fraudulent fines, increased HOA dues, and the costs of documenting and legally challenging everything, my resources were being stretched thin. This was clearly part of their strategy. War of attrition, HOA style, but they'd made a crucial mistake in their calculations. In the Marines, we're taught that when you're under siege, the most important resource isn't ammunition or supplies. It's patience, and I had plenty of that. More importantly, I had something they didn't know about yet, a tactical advantage that would turn their own strategy against them. Despite the escalating situation, I decided to make one last attempt at a reasonable resolution. 20 years in the Marines teaches you that sometimes the best victories come through diplomacy rather than combat. I scheduled a meeting with my lawyer, documented everything thoroughly, and prepared a reasonable compromise proposal. If they wanted a community pool, fine, but it needed to be done legally and fairly. My proposal was straightforward. I would agree to sell a portion of my property to the HOA at actual market value, not their manipulated assessment, provided they would rectify the drainage issues, adjust the lighting to reasonable levels, and most importantly, restore the natural spring system that they'd disrupted. The proposal included having independent environmental experts assess the impact of the pool on the local watershed. I presented this at the next HOA meeting, maintaining a professional demeanor despite Trish's obvious smirk. As a gesture of good faith, I explained, I'm willing to work towards a solution that benefits everyone. All I'm asking for is fair compensation and proper environmental consideration. Trish's response was predictable, but still disappointing. While we appreciate your and creative proposal, she said, emphasizing the word creative, like it was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. The matter has already been settled legally. The pool is community property now, and any modifications would require a full board vote and significant expense. I tried a different approach, appealing directly to the other homeowners present. Look, we all want what's best for the neighborhood, but this isn't just about a pool, it's about how we treat each other as neighbors and how we respect property rights. What happened to my land could happen to any of you. That's when Trish showed her true colors. She stood up, adjusting her designer blazer with practiced precision. James, she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, I understand that readjusting to civilian life can be challenging. Perhaps your time in the military has made it difficult for you to accept community-focused decisions. Have you considered speaking with someone about these adjustment issues? The room grew uncomfortably quiet. She'd just played her masterstroke, implying that my objections were the result of PTSD or other service-related issues. It was a clever, Tactical move, I had to admit. Any angry response from me would only reinforce her narrative. Jim stood up from the back of the room. As another veteran, he said calmly, I can assure everyone that James's concerns have nothing to do with military service and everything to do with basic property rights. I move that we put his proposal to a vote. I'm afraid that's not possible, Trish replied smoothly. According to our bylaws, any proposal involving financial expenditure must be submitted in writing 30 days in advance of a vote, with detailed cost analysis and impact studies. Like the emergency session where you approved the pool, Mrs. Chen called out from her seat. Several neighbors murmured in agreement. Trish's smile tightened. That was an emergency action, perfectly legal under Section 12 of our bylaws. Now, unless there's any other new business. After the meeting, my lawyer advised me that while my proposal was reasonable, the HOA had effectively insulated themselves legally. They're banking on the fact that most homeowners won't have the resources for a prolonged legal battle, he explained. Their strategy is to drag this out until you give up. I made one final attempt at peace, requesting a private meeting with Trish and the HOA board. To my surprise, they agreed. The meeting was set for 900 hours in the clubhouse, my former pond. As I sat across from them, watching sunlight reflect off the chlorinated water that had replaced my natural spring, I realized this wasn't going to end well. I'm willing to drop all potential legal claims, I offered, in exchange for reasonable modifications to the pool complex and fair compensation for my property. Trish leaned forward, her expression almost predatory. James, let me be very clear. The pool isn't going anywhere. The lights will stay exactly as they are. And if you continue to create problems, we'll be forced to place a lien on your property for unpaid fines and violations. Do you really want to risk losing your home over this? That's when I knew there would be no peaceful resolution. Some people mistake reasonable negotiation for weakness, and Trish was one of them. She thought she had all the power, that her wall of bureaucracy and bylaws made her untouchable. As I left the clubhouse, I heard her call out, "Do think carefully about your next move, James. Not everyone is cut out for community living." I stopped at the door, but didn't turn around. You know what they teach us in the Marines, ma'am? When conventional tactics fail, it's time for unconventional warfare. The game was about to change. Trish thought she was fighting a battle over property rights. She was about to learn she'd started a war, and she had no idea what kind of arsenal I had at my disposal. Every successful military operation starts with reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. After the failed peace negotiations, I switched to full tactical mode. First step, assemble my team. Jim had already proven himself a valuable ally, and his background in Army intelligence would be crucial for what I had planned. We need to go deeper than just the HOA records, Jim said as we sat in my garage, now converted into our command center. Something about this whole setup stinks worse than month-old MREs. He had brought over his laptop and a stack of documents that would make a Pentagon clerk proud. Sarah, my sister, joined our planning session via video call. Her real estate expertise was proving invaluable. "I've been digging into the property records," she reported. "There's something interesting about the timing of all this. Trish moved into the neighborhood just 18 months ago, right when the previous HOA president suddenly decided to retire and move to Florida. Mrs. Chen provided another crucial piece of intelligence. She'd been keeping a detailed diary of all HOA activities for the past 5 years, a habit she'd developed during her youth in China, where she'd learned the importance of documenting everything. The previous HOA president, she told us, he was very resistant to any major changes. Then Trish arrived, and within 2 months, he sold his house for well above market value. I started mapping everything on a large whiteboard, just like we did in mission planning. Dates, connections, money trails, a pattern was emerging. Jim's research revealed that the construction company wasn't just owned by Trish's brother-in-law. It was part of a larger development corporation that had been buying up properties throughout the region. "Look at this," Jim pointed to his screen. "Every neighborhood where they've taken control of the HOA has seen the same pattern. They start with community improvements that require seizing or modifying private property. Then they gradually increase dues and fines until homeowners are forced to sell." The environmental angle was proving particularly interesting. I'd contacted an old Marine buddy who now worked for the EPA. He couldn't get officially involved without a formal complaint, but he did point me towards some public records that showed the natural spring under my former pond was part of a protected watershed system. The permits they obtained from the city planning office, my lawyer explained during our next meeting. They're technically valid, but they don't mention anything about the spring. Either they didn't know about it, which seems unlikely given the environmental survey they claim to have done, or they deliberately omitted that information. I also started documenting every violation of pool safety regulations. The emergency equipment was often poorly maintained, the chemical storage didn't meet code, and the required safety inspections were being pencil-whipped, signed off without proper checks. I took photos, recorded videos, and kept detailed logs of every infraction. The financial aspect required more subtle investigation. Sarah discovered that the HOA's reserve study, the document showing how they planned to pay for long-term maintenance, was full of questionable assumptions and hidden costs. The pool's operating expenses were already exceeding their estimates, but instead of acknowledging the problem, they were burying the overages in various administrative fees. "They're setting up for something bigger," Jim concluded after reviewing all our findings. "This pool was just phase 1. Look at these zoning variance requests they've filed with the city. They're planning to turn this whole section of the neighborhood into some kind of resort complex." Mrs. Chen had noticed unusual activity too. "Last week," she reported, "I saw Trish meeting with some men in suits. They were looking at plans, pointing at different houses on the street. When they saw me watching, they quickly packed everything up. I decided to add another layer to our intelligence gathering. Using my military contacts, I found a private investigator who specialized in corporate fraud. He started following the money trail, looking into the relationships between Trish's development corporation, the construction company, and various shell companies that had been buying properties in the area. The evidence was mounting, but we needed to be strategic about how we used it. "Remember," my lawyer cautioned, "they've got their own legal team, and they're prepared for standard property disputes. We need something they won't expect." That's when I remembered something from my last deployment. We'd been tracking a particularly clever adversary who kept slipping through conventional nets. The solution hadn't been to confront them directly, but to let them think they were winning while we quietly positioned our assets for a coordinated strike. I looked at the whiteboard, now covered with connections and evidence. "We're not going to fight them on their terms," I announced to my team. "They think they're running a sophisticated real estate operation. They're about to learn they've stumbled into a military-grade counterinsurgency." Jim grinned, recognizing the strategy. Classic pincer movement, hit them from multiple directions at once? Exactly. But first, we need to let them get a little more confident, a little more careless. Sometimes you have to let the enemy advance to expose their supply lines. The pieces were falling into place. Trish and her development corporation had built what they thought was an impregnable fortress of legal documents and HOA bylaws. They weren't prepared for an opponent who'd spent 20 years learning how to breach enemy fortifications. The catalyst came on a stormy Tuesday night, exactly the kind of situation I'd been worried about since they'd altered the natural drainage system. The Weather Service had issued flash flood warnings for the area, and I'd spent the evening documenting water levels around my property. What happened next would change everything. Around 2300 hours, I heard shouting from the pool area. Despite the late hour and heavy rain, several emergency vehicles were arriving, their lights cutting through the downpour. Years of combat training kicked in. I grabbed my first aid kit and headed out into the storm. The scene at the pool was chaos. The drainage problems had finally caught up with them in the worst possible way. The underground spring, which they'd improperly diverted during construction, had found a new path. Water was literally bubbling up through cracks in the pool deck, destabilizing the entire structure. Part of the concrete had collapsed, creating a sinkhole that was growing by the minute. "Where's the emergency shutoff for the pool systems?" one of the firefighters shouted. Nobody knew. The pool maintenance manual Trish always bragged about was apparently more fiction than fact. I pushed through the growing crowd to the equipment room, remembering the layout from my documentation efforts. "Main power panel is on the north wall," I called out. "Water shutoff should be behind the chemical storage unit." The firefighters moved quickly, following my directions. 20 years of emergency response training makes you notice these details, even when you're documenting violations. That's when I heard Mrs. Chen's voice, high with panic. "The chemicals! The pool chemicals are flooding into my garden!" The improperly stored chlorine and acid containers were being carried by the floodwater, creating a toxic soup that was flowing directly into neighboring properties. Jim arrived, still in his pajamas, but moving with military precision. "We need to evacuate this side of the street," he said, already pulling out his phone to call for hazmat support. That chemical combination could create chlorine gas. The next few hours were a blur of emergency response activity. Fire department, hazmat teams, city emergency management, all the people Trish had avoided during her rush construction project were now on scene, documenting everything. I kept my phone recording, capturing every detail. Around 300 hours, Trish finally arrived, looking considerably less polished than usual in hastily thrown-on clothes. She tried to take control of the situation, waving her HOA authority like a shield, but the emergency responders weren't interested in HOA bylaws. They were interested in why there was no emergency response plan, why chemicals were improperly stored, and most importantly, why their structural engineering maps showed a natural spring that wasn't mentioned in any of the pool construction permits. "This is just a minor maintenance issue," Trish insisted, trying to prevent the hazmat team from accessing certain areas. "The HOA has procedures for handling these situations." "Ma'am," the fire captain replied, "we have a sinkhole expanding under an unauthorized pool structure, hazardous materials, contaminating residential property, and potential groundwater contamination. This isn't a maintenance issue. This is a public safety emergency." I watched as city inspectors documented every violation, every shortcut, every bit of evidence we'd been carefully gathering for weeks. But now it wasn't just my documentation. It was official government records. The HOA's insurance adjuster arrived, looking increasingly alarmed as he realized the extent of their liability. The final blow came when the EPA representatives showed up just before dawn, alerted by the potential groundwater contamination. They took one look at the situation and immediately began asking questions about permits and environmental impact studies. Trish's carefully constructed house of cards was collapsing faster than the pool deck. Mrs. Chen's garden was destroyed. The toxic runoff had killed plants that she'd been tending for decades. I found her sitting on her back porch, tears mixing with the rain as she surveyed the damage. That was the moment I knew we weren't just fighting for my property anymore. This had become something much bigger. As the sun rose, casting harsh light on the disaster zone that had once been my peaceful backyard, I could see Trish huddled with her board members, their faces tight with worry. They knew this was bad, but they didn't yet realize just how bad it was about to get. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Jim asked, coming to stand beside me as we watched the EPA team taking water samples. "That this is our Normandy?" I replied. The moment we've been waiting for? He nodded. They gave us everything we needed. Documentation, official reports, multiple agency investigations, and witnesses, I added, looking at the growing crowd of neighbors, many of whom were filming everything on their phones. Lots of witnesses. The storm had done what all our careful planning couldn't. It had exposed the rotten foundation Trish had built her empire on. Now it was time to launch our counter-offensive, and thanks to this disaster, we had reinforcements we hadn't counted on. Sometimes the best tactical advantage comes from letting your enemy's mistakes play out to their natural conclusion. The morning after the disaster, I initiated what we called Operation Watershed. In the Marines, we learned that the best time to launch a counter-offensive is when your opponent is still reeling from an unexpected blow. Trish and her board were about to learn this lesson the hard way. First, I contacted every agency that had responded to the emergency: fire department, EPA, city engineers, hazmat teams. I formally requested copies of all their reports and documentation. Meanwhile, Jim was coordinating with neighbors to collect their video footage and photos from the incident. Mrs. Chen, despite her devastation, provided her detailed journals, documenting every HOA meeting and decision leading up to the pool construction. We're not just building a case, I explained to my lawyer as we reviewed the mounting evidence. We're creating a perfect storm of regulatory oversight. He nodded, understanding the strategy. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about public safety, environmental protection, and corporate accountability. Sarah had made a crucial discovery through her real estate connections. The development corporation behind all this, she reported via video call. They've done this before in 3 other communities, but they've never dealt with environmental violations of this scale. Their insurance won't cover willful negligence or fraudulent permits. I decided to take a page from Trish's playbook. I called for an emergency HOA meeting, but unlike her carefully orchestrated sessions, this one would be different. I scheduled it for 1900 hours, when most residents could attend, and I invited representatives from every agency involved in the incident. The community center was packed. Trish and her board members sat at their usual table, but their usual confidence was noticeably absent. The EPA representative spoke first, detailing the environmental violations and potential groundwater contamination. The city engineer followed, explaining how the unauthorized modification of the natural spring had created a dangerous structural situation. Then came the fire captain, whose presentation included dramatic footage from the night of the disaster. This facility, he concluded, lacks basic safety measures required by law. The chemical storage alone violates multiple regulations. We're looking at serious liability issues. I stood up next, carrying a thick binder of documentation. As a homeowner and a veteran, I began, I believe in following proper procedures and respecting authority, so I've documented everything. I started displaying photos and documents on the projector screen. Every violation, every shortcut, every instance of negligence. But this isn't just about regulations, I continued. This is about our community, about Mrs. Chen's destroyed garden, about the environmental damage that will take years to repair, about every homeowner whose property values and safety have been compromised by reckless decisions. That's when I played my trump card. I've spoken with state prosecutors, I announced. They're very interested in how a private development corporation managed to seize private property and construct a hazardous facility without proper permits or environmental impact studies. They're particularly interested in the connection between our HOA president and the construction company owned by her brother-in-law. Trish tried to interrupt, but I wasn't finished. I'm also happy to announce that the Army Corps of Engineers will be conducting a full investigation into the disruption of protected watershed systems. They take a special interest in cases involving veterans' property rights. The room erupted in conversation. Neighbors were shouting questions at the board. Someone started passing around a petition calling for their immediate resignation. Trish attempted to call for order, but her authority had evaporated like chlorine in the sun. "One more thing," I added, my voice cutting through the chaos. "I've filed a formal complaint with the state's HOA Oversight Committee. They'll be conducting a full audit of all HOA financial records, including those interesting transfers between the Development Corporation and certain board members' personal accounts." Jim stood up next, adding his own evidence about the pattern of property acquisitions and forced sales in other neighborhoods. Mrs. Chen followed, her quiet dignity more powerful than any shout, as she described watching her garden die from chemical contamination. The meeting ended with Trish and her board members hurrying out, already on their phones, with what I assumed were their lawyers. But they weren't just facing legal problems now, they were facing a community that had woken up to their manipulation, armed with evidence that couldn't be buried under HOA bylaws. As people filed out of the meeting, several neighbors stopped to shake my hand. "You know what this reminds me of?" Jim said, as we watched Trish's hasty retreat. "Remember that time in Basic when the drill sergeant thought he had everyone fooled, right until inspection day?" I smiled, remembering, sometimes the best defense is a thoroughly documented offense. And having a few government agencies in your corner doesn't hurt either. The battle wasn't over, but we'd achieved what every military strategist aims for. We'd seized the initiative. Trish's carefully constructed empire was about to face a multi-front assault, and this time she couldn't hide behind HOA bylaws. The aftermath of the emergency meeting was like watching a carefully planned demolition. Everything fell exactly where we expected it to. Within 24 hours, Trish's carefully constructed facade began crumbling faster than that pool deck during the storm. The first hits came from the regulatory agencies. The EPA moved swiftly, issuing an emergency order to close the pool facility pending a full environmental impact investigation. Their preliminary report cited willful negligence in the handling of hazardous materials and deliberate misrepresentation of watershed impact. The sight of officials placing "facility closed" environmental hazard signs around my former backyard was satisfying in a way that 20 years of military service had taught me to appreciate. Trish tried to maintain control, sending out an HOA-wide email claiming this was all a temporary setback and minor regulatory confusion. Her message promised that their legal team would have everything sorted out within days. What she didn't know was that her legal team was already jumping ship. "Your documentation was the key," my lawyer informed me during our morning briefing. When their attorneys saw the evidence package we submitted to the state prosecutors, they filed a motion to withdraw as counsel. Apparently, they're not interested in defending potential criminal fraud charges. The city engineers weren't any more forgiving. Their comprehensive structural assessment revealed that the pool's foundation was compromised beyond repair. "The natural spring is essentially eating away at the substrate," the chief engineer explained during his inspection. "Whoever approved these plans either didn't know about basic hydrology or deliberately ignored it." Local media caught wind of the story, an HOA stealing a veteran's property while he was deployed, only to create an environmental hazard that threatened an entire community. They were particularly interested in the financial connections we'd uncovered. One investigative reporter had already traced the pattern of similar developments in other neighborhoods, leading to a series of exposés about predatory HOA takeovers. Mrs. Chen's garden became a powerful symbol of the HOA's negligence. Professional assessments showed that the soil contamination from the chemical spill had rendered her yard unsafe for growing food for at least the next 5 years. When she gave a quiet, dignified interview about losing decades of carefully cultivated heritage plants, public sympathy swung decisively against the HOA board. The Development Corporation tried to distance itself from the situation, issuing a statement claiming they were just contractors following HOA specifications. But our investigation had revealed too many connections. The State Attorney General's office announced they were launching a probe into potential real estate fraud and environmental violations across multiple communities. Trish made one last attempt to rally support, calling another emergency HOA meeting. This time, though, the community center was filled with angry homeowners, armed with questions about their property values and legal liability. The meeting quickly devolved into chaos. "Can someone explain why our HOA dues were used to pay for permits that didn't actually exist?" one neighbor demanded. "What about our insurance rates? Who's paying for that increase?" another shouted. Trish tried to maintain her composure, but her usual polished demeanor was cracking. When someone asked directly about her brother-in-law's construction company, she actually snapped, "I am not obligated to discuss my personal business relationships with the community." That's when Jim stood up, calm and collected in the way only military veterans can be in chaos. "Actually, ma'am, as HOA president managing community funds, you are legally obligated to disclose any potential conflicts of interest. It's right here in the state HOA regulations." He held up a highlighted copy of the law. The meeting ended abruptly when Trish received an urgent call and rushed out. We later learned that state investigators had just served a search warrant at the Development Corporation's offices. Back at my house that evening, watching the pool, facility sitting empty and condemned behind official warning tape, I felt a complex mix of emotions. The spring water was already reclaiming its territory, seeping through the cracks in the concrete like nature's own form of justice. "You know what this reminds me of?" Jim said, joining me at the window. "Remember those operations where the target would try to maintain their cover story even after we had all the evidence?" I nodded. "They never expect the coordinated strike. They're so used to dealing with isolated complaints that they don't prepare for someone who knows how to synchronize multiple assets." My phone buzzed with a news alert. The Development Corporation stock was in freefall as investors learned about the multiple investigations. Trish's carefully built empire wasn't just taking hits, it was imploding from within. "Think they've learned their lesson about messing with veterans' property?" Jim asked. "They're about to learn a lot of lessons," I replied, "about property rights, environmental regulations, and why you don't steal from someone who spent 20 years learning. Strategic operations, but this was just the initial impact. The real aftermath was still to come. And Trish was about to learn that in both military and legal operations, the first strike is often just the beginning. The next phase of our operation unfolded with the precision of a well-planned military campaign. Multiple government agencies descended on Maple Ridge estates, each with their own investigators and objectives, but all focused on the same target, Trish's web of corruption and negligence. The EPA took command of the pool site, setting up a mobile command center that reminded me of forward operating bases I'd seen overseas. They brought in specialized equipment to test groundwater contamination levels and assess the damage to the natural spring system. The preliminary results were worse than even we had anticipated. "This isn't just surface contamination," the lead EPA investigator explained during a community briefing. "The improper chemical storage and drainage modifications have created a potential superfund situation. The Development Corporation will be held financially responsible for full environmental remediation." The Army Corps of Engineers arrived next. Their presence a direct result of my military connections and the watershed violations. Their assessment was equally damning. "This construction project shows a complete disregard for basic hydrogeological principles," their chief engineer stated. "The modifications to the natural spring have compromised the entire local water system. State prosecutors set up shop in the community center, taking depositions from homeowners about the HOA's practices. They were particularly interested in how the emergency voting sessions had been conducted and the pattern of selective enforcement of HOA rules against anyone who questioned Trish's authority. "It's like watching dominoes fall," Jim commented, as we observed another team of investigators entering the HOA office with boxes and digital forensics equipment. Each agency's findings support and reinforce the others. The city building department conducted their own audit, going through every permit and inspection record. They discovered that many of the required inspections had never actually occurred. The signatures had been forged. The inspector whose name was on the documents had retired 6 months before the pool construction even began. The investigation into the financial aspects was equally revealing. The state's HOA Oversight Committee found multiple irregularities in the books. They were running a shell game, the forensic accountant explained, moving money between accounts to hide the true costs and kickbacks. Mrs. Chen proved to be an unexpected asset to the investigators. Her meticulous journals provided a timeline that helped track exactly when and how the corruption had spread through the HOA board. Her documentation of board meetings, complete with direct quotes and dated entries, was admissible as contemporary evidence. My security cameras had captured more than just violations. They'd recorded multiple instances of Trish and board members discussing their plans, apparently unaware that their conversations near the pool equipment room were being recorded. The audio quality wasn't perfect, but phrases like, "They'll never," "prove it," and "by the time anyone figures it out, we'll be long gone," were clear enough. The local media was having a field day. Veterans' property rights violated, HOA scandal exposes widespread corruption, ran as the leading story on multiple news channels. The coverage caught the attention of several veterans' advocacy groups, who reached out to offer support and legal resources. Trish attempted to maintain control through it all, but her position was crumbling. When she tried to call another board meeting to address these baseless allegations, she discovered the community center had been designated as a temporary evidence collection site by the state investigators. "I think what surprises me most," one of the state investigators confided, "is how blatant they were. Usually these operations try to maintain better cover, but they acted like they were untouchable." The investigation expanded beyond our neighborhood as other communities came forward with similar stories about the development corporation's tactics. Pattern recognition is a crucial military skill, and the pattern here was clear. Find a neighborhood, take control of the HOA, force out existing homeowners through various means, then redevelop the property for massive profit. My lawyer was working overtime, coordinating with all the different agencies and ensuring that our evidence was properly handled. "In 20 years of HOA disputes," he said, "I've never seen such a complete dismantling of a corrupt board. Your military planning experience really paid off." The turning point came when the FBI joined the investigation, citing potential wire fraud and interstate commerce violations. Watching federal agents walk into the HOA office with search warrants, I was reminded of large-scale military operations where multiple units coordinate for maximum effect. "You know what this reminds me of?" Jim said, watching another team of investigators arrive. "Remember that time in training when the opposing force thought they had the perfect defensive position right until they realized they were surrounded?" Nodded. Sometimes the best strategy is to let your opponent think they're winning, right until the moment they realize they've lost everything. The authorities weren't just investigating anymore. They were building a case that would ensure this kind of abuse couldn't happen again. Trish had wanted to make an example of our community. She was about to get her wish, just not in the way she'd planned. The final unraveling of Trish's empire came faster than even I expected. In the military, we have a saying, "The bigger they are, the harder they fall." Trish's carefully constructed facade didn't just fall, it shattered, spectacularly in front of the entire community. It started during a press conference she'd called to address recent concerns. The setting was pure Trish. She'd rented a conference room at an upscale hotel, arranged for professional lighting, and even had a podium with the HOA logo. She clearly thought this would be her moment to regain control of the narrative. Was there with Jim, sitting quietly in the back, watching her final performance. She stood at the podium in her designer suit, projecting an image of confident authority as cameras rolled. "The recent allegations against our homeowners association are completely unfounded," she began, her practiced smile firmly in place. "We have always operated with full transparency, and..." That's when the FBI agents walked in. The look on her face when they approached the podium was something I'll never forget. 20 years in the Marines taught me to recognize the exact moment when someone realizes they've lost everything. For Trish, that moment came when the lead agent said, "Patricia Wellington, we have a federal warrant for your arrest." The charges were read out loud, right there in front of the rolling cameras. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud, environmental violations, fraudulent permit applications, misappropriation of HOA funds, and, this one was particularly satisfying, violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. "But the HOA bylaws give us full authority." Trish started to protest. "HOA bylaws don't override federal law, ma'am," the agent replied, "and they certainly don't authorize criminal conspiracy." The evidence presented was overwhelming. The FBI had executed simultaneous raids on the Development Corporation's offices and several board members' homes. They'd uncovered emails, text messages, and recorded conversations detailing the entire scheme. One particularly damning email chain showed Trish discussing my deployment with her brother-in-law. Perfect timing. He'll be out of the country for months. By the time he gets back, it'll be too late to stop the project. These military types are all about following rules. They won't know how to fight back once it's done. The state's investigation revealed that my property wasn't their first target. They'd pulled similar schemes in other neighborhoods, but they'd never been bold enough to target an actively deployed service member before. That had been their fatal mistake. Mrs. Chen's meticulous records proved crucial in the prosecution's case. Her detailed notes of every interaction, every violation notice, every subtle threat matched perfectly with the electronic evidence the FBI had uncovered. When she testified about the destruction of her garden, describing decades of carefully cultivated plants killed by improperly stored chemicals, even the most hardened investigators were moved. The Development Corporation tried to distance itself, claiming Trish had gone rogue and acted without their knowledge, but the financial records told a different story. The FBI had traced millions of dollars in kickbacks and hidden payments, all carefully laundered through a network of shell companies. "Look at her now," Jim whispered as we watched Trish being led away in handcuffs, not so smug without her HOA authority to hide behind. The other board members didn't fare much better. One broke down during questioning and offered to testify against the others in exchange for leniency. He revealed that the entire pool project had been part of a larger scheme to force out existing homeowners and redevelop the entire neighborhood into luxury condominiums. The EPA's final report was the nail in the coffin. The environmental damage from their negligence would cost millions to remediate. The natural spring system had been severely compromised, and the chemical contamination had spread further than initially estimated. The Development Corporation's insurance refused to cover the damages, citing willful negligence and criminal activity. Watching Trish's perp walk on the evening news, I felt no satisfaction, just a quiet sense of justice being served. In the Marines, we're taught that victory isn't about personal glory. It's about completing the mission and protecting what's right. "You know what the best part is?" Jim said as we watched the coverage. They thought they could get away with it because you were deployed. They never understood that military service teaches you exactly how to fight this kind of battle. My phone buzzed with messages from other veterans who'd seen the story. Many had similar experiences with predatory HOAs and development companies. This case was setting a precedent that would help protect other service members' property rights. The final irony. The FBI's investigation revealed that Trish had never actually owned her home in our neighborhood. She'd been living in a property owned by the Development Corporation, placed there specifically to take over the HOA. She wasn't even a real resident, just another piece in their fraudulent scheme. In the aftermath of Trish's arrest, our community underwent a transformation that reminded me of how military units bond after surviving a shared ordeal. The first community meeting after her downfall was held in my garage, the same space, where we'd planned our counteroffensive. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. We need to rebuild more than just the physical damage, Jim said, addressing the packed garage. Neighbors had brought folding chairs, and Mrs. Chen had supplied her signature dumplings. There was a sense of unity I hadn't felt in the neighborhood since before Trish's arrival. The immediate concerns were practical. The pool complex was now a condemned structure. My backyard was an environmental cleanup site, and the HOA's insurance company was trying to deny coverage for everything. But instead of falling apart, the community rallied. A local environmental law firm offered to represent all affected homeowners pro bono. When we heard about what happened to a deployed service member's property, the lead attorney explained, we knew we had to get involved. This case represents everything wrong with predatory development practices. Mrs. Chen's situation became a rallying point. A group of local master gardeners volunteered to help design a rehabilitation plan for her contaminated garden. They discovered that while the surface soil was damaged, the deeper soil layers could be saved through specialized treatment. The university's agricultural department offered to help preserve samples of her remaining plants for future restoration. In my country, Mrs. Chen said during one of our planning sessions, we have a saying, after the storm, the bamboo that bends survives better than the oak that resists. Our community bent, but we did not break. The State HOA Oversight Committee appointed a temporary administrator to handle our association's affairs. She was a retired judge who specialized in property law, and her first act was to invalidate all of Trish's emergency rule changes. The second was to launch a complete audit of our finances. The good news, she reported at our next meeting, is that we've frozen all suspicious transactions. The bad news is that recovering the misappropriated funds will take time. However, the Development Corporation's assets have been seized as part of the federal investigation, which gives us a strong position for restitution. Support came from unexpected places. A veterans group that specialized in construction projects offered to help restore my property once the EPA cleared the site. We take care of our own, their coordinator said, and what happened here needs to be a warning to any other HOA thinking about taking advantage of deployed service members. Local media coverage attracted attention from state legislators. 2 representatives visited our neighborhood, walking through the damage and taking notes. They were particularly interested in the way Trish's group had manipulated HOA regulations to seize private property. We're drafting new legislation, one representative explained, strengthening protections for homeowners and adding specific provisions for deployed service members. If you're willing, we'd like to call it the Maple Ridge Act. The community's children got involved too. They organized a bake sale to raise money for Mrs. Chen's garden restoration, setting up tables right in front of the condemned pool. The irony of selling lemonade in front of Trish's failed power play wasn't lost on anyone. Jim coordinated with other veterans in the area to establish a property rights advocacy network. What happened here isn't isolated, he explained. Development, Corporations are trying similar tactics in other neighborhoods. We need to share what we learned about fighting back. Even the city building department stepped up. They fast-tracked permits for restoration work and offered to waive fees for any repairs related to the damage caused by the pool complex. The chief inspector personally apologized for not catching the forged documentation sooner. The most profound change was in how neighbors interacted with each other. The divisions Trish had created between old residents and new, between those who supported her projects and those who opposed them, began to heal. People started helping each other with home repairs, sharing resources, and rebuilding the sense of community that had been lost. "You know what this reminds me of?" I said to Jim, as we watched neighbors working together to clear debris from Mrs. Chen's yard. "Remember how units would come together after surviving a difficult mission?" He nodded. "Battle-forged bonds. Nothing unites people like overcoming a common enemy. The EPA team supervising the cleanup became part of our community too. They set up regular briefings to keep everyone informed about the progress, and their lead scientist started giving impromptu environmental science lessons to neighborhood kids who were curious about their equipment. In all my years of remediation work," the EPA supervisor told me, "I've never seen a community come together like this. Usually, environmental disasters tear neighborhoods apart. You folks have turned it into a rallying point." Looking around at my neighbors working together, planning together, supporting each other, I realized we'd won something more important than just a legal victory. We'd rediscovered what community really means, not the artificial unity Trish tried to force through her rules and regulations, but the genuine bonds that form when people stand together against injustice. Justice, when it finally arrived, came in waves. The federal courthouse was packed for Trish's sentencing hearing, not just with our neighbors, but with residents from other communities who'd suffered similar schemes. I sat in my dress blues, Mrs. Chen on one side of me, Jim on the other, watching justice unfold with military precision. The prosecutor's presentation was devastating. She had mounted evidence boards showing the progression of the scheme, from Trish's tactical insertion into our community to the systematic dismantling of homeowners' rights. The financial trails were laid out in detail, showing how money flowed through various shell companies back to the development corporation. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "this case represents more than just fraud or environmental violations. This was a calculated attack on property rights, specifically targeting a service member who was deployed overseas, defending the very rights being stolen from him." Trish's defense strategy crumbled under the weight of evidence. Her attempt to shift blame to the development corporation backfired when their former CFO, who'd taken a plea deal, testified about her central role in the scheme. The emails where she discussed targeting my property while I was deployed were particularly damning. The defendant didn't just violate environmental regulations or HOA bylaws, the prosecutor continued. She violated the trust of an entire community and specifically chose to act while a service member was deployed, believing his absence would prevent any effective resistance. The judge, a Vietnam veteran himself, listened intently to the evidence. When it came time for sentencing, his words were precise and measured, like artillery fire on target. "Ms. Wellington," he began, "this court has seen many cases of fraud and corruption, but few have displayed such calculated disregard for both law and basic decency. You deliberately targeted a deployed service member's property, endangered an entire community through environmental negligence, and abused your position of trust for personal gain." The sentence was comprehensive. 5 years in federal prison, full restitution to all affected homeowners, and a lifetime ban from serving in any HOA or property management role. The Development Corporation's executives received similar sentences, and their assets were seized for restitution. But the justice didn't stop there. The EPA's Enforcement Division levied the largest fine in state history for environmental violations. The Army Corps of Engineers filed separate charges for watershed destruction, resulting in additional penalties and mandatory restoration requirements. In my 20 years on the bench, the judge concluded, I've never seen a more thorough dismantling of a criminal enterprise disguised as legitimate business. This case should serve as a warning to any organization thinking of exploiting homeowners or taking advantage of deployed service members. The state legislature fast-tracked the Maple Ridge Act, creating new protections for homeowners and specific penalties for HOAs that violate service members' rights. I was asked to testify at the legislative hearing, where I explained how Trish's group had exploited loopholes in existing laws. As a Marine, I told the legislative committee, I was trained to defend against external threats. I never expected to have to defend my own property from domestic predators hiding behind HOA authority. The restitution package was comprehensive. The seized assets from the Development Corporation were liquidated to create a fund for repairs and restoration. Mrs. Chen received special compensation for her destroyed garden, including funds for soil rehabilitation and rare plant replacement. My property was designated for complete restoration, with the EPA overseeing the removal of the pool complex and reconstruction of the natural spring system. The Army Corps of Engineers provided technical expertise to ensure the watershed was properly restored. You know what the best part is, Jim said as we watched the demolition crew begin removing the pool structure. They thought targeting a deployed service member would make their job easier. Instead, it brought down their entire operation. The federal investigation expanded to other states, uncovering similar schemes by related development corporations. Our case had opened a Pandora's box of real estate fraud and environmental violations, leading to a nationwide crackdown on predatory HOA practices. The local media covered the sentencing extensively. HOA president gets federal prison for targeting veterans' property, ran as the headline. The story became a cautionary tale in property management circles and a case study in real estate law courses. As Trish was led away in handcuffs, I remembered something my first commanding officer had told me. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about restoration and prevention. This case had achieved both. Not only were the perpetrators being punished, but new protections were being put in place to prevent similar schemes in the future. The victory felt different from any I'd experienced in the military. It wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about protecting home and community, the very things I'd spent my military career fighting to defend. The restoration of our community began in earnest once the legal dust settled. The EPA's cleanup team arrived first, bringing in specialized equipment to begin the environmental remediation. It was like watching a military engineering unit at work, precise, methodical, and thorough. The first priority was removing the failed pool complex. They didn't just demolish it. They carefully documented every aspect of its construction, preserving evidence of the violations while methodically dismantling the structure. Each piece of concrete removed revealed more evidence of how corners had been cut and safety regulations ignored. Look at these support structures, the head engineer pointed out. They didn't even properly seal them against water intrusion. This whole thing was a disaster waiting to happen. The revelation that we'd narrowly avoided a catastrophic collapse added weight to the justice that had been served. The compensation package was more comprehensive than we'd expected. The federal court had appointed a special master to oversee the distribution of seized assets, ensuring every affected homeowner received proper restitution. My property's restoration was fully funded, including complete reconstruction of the natural spring system and surrounding landscape. Mrs. Chen's case received special attention. The court recognized her garden as both cultural heritage and valuable ecological property. The compensation included not just monetary value, but also funded a partnership with the State University's Botanical Department to preserve and restore her unique plant collection. In 40 years in America, she told me, tears in her eyes, I have never seen such respect for what was lost. The university team had already started cultivating samples from her surviving plants, ensuring that decades of careful breeding wouldn't be lost. The Army Corps of Engineers brought in hydrologists to map the underground spring system. They discovered that the natural water flow could be restored, though it would take careful engineering. Your spring is part of a larger watershed network, the lead hydrologist explained. Restoring it properly will help heal the entire local ecosystem. Insurance money from the Development Corporation's seized assets covered more than just property damage. They were required to compensate for loss of property value, emotional distress, and even the increased utility costs we'd incurred during the pool operation. The financial recovery was thorough enough that some neighbors joked it was almost worth the ordeal. Almost. Jim coordinated with veteran support organizations to establish a legal defense fund for service members facing similar situations. What happened here can't happen again, he said during the fund's launch. We're making sure every deployed service member has resources to protect their property rights. The restoration work became a community project. Local landscaping companies volunteered equipment and labor. The City Parks Department offered expertise in native plant restoration. Even the local high school's environmental club got involved, using our recovery project as a real-world case study in ecosystem rehabilitation. The Aish EPA team made an unexpected discovery during the cleanup. Beneath the pool's foundation, they found evidence of the original Springs Path, a natural watercourse that had existed for centuries before development. This discovery led to a modified restoration plan that would not only repair the damage, but improve the natural water flow. Your property is going to be better than before, the EPA supervisor explained. We're not just fixing what was broken, we're enhancing the entire ecosystem. The new design would include natural filtration systems and habitat areas for local wildlife, including a proper nesting area for wood ducks. The financial compensation wasn't just about money. The court ordered the Development Corporation to fund educational programs about property rights and environmental protection. Our case became a teaching tool for law schools and real estate programs, showing how community action could successfully fight corporate overreach. My workshop, which had suffered water damage during the ordeal, was fully restored with upgraded equipment. The court recognized it as both personal property and a community resource, given how I'd used it to help neighbors with furniture repairs. The restoration included proper ventilation systems and enhanced storage, improvements I'd always wanted but couldn't previously afford. Mrs. Chen's new garden plan incorporated elements of traditional Chinese design with modern environmental protection features. The university team helped design a sophisticated irrigation system that would protect her plants from any future contamination. Sometimes, she said, surveying the work in progress, what is rebuilt can be stronger than what was lost. The recovery process helped heal community divisions too. Neighbors who had initially supported Trish's plans, now understanding how they'd been manipulated, joined in the restoration efforts. Working together to rebuild created new bonds and strengthened old ones. As I watched the progress from my back deck, Jim joined me with his usual perfect timing. You know what this reminds me of? He asked. Remember those reconstruction missions after conflict zones? How communities would come together to rebuild? I nodded. But this is different. We're not just rebuilding what was destroyed. We're creating something better, something that can't be taken away so easily. The final dismantling of Trish's operation was more complete than any of us had anticipated. Like watching a house of cards collapse, each new revelation brought down another piece of their carefully constructed scheme. The development corporations' attempts to distance themselves from Trish backfired spectacularly when federal investigators uncovered their entire operational playbook. Through seized emails and documents, we learned that our neighborhood hadn't been their first target, just their most ambitious one. They had a formula: identify neighborhoods with potential for luxury development, infiltrate the HOA through planted agents like Trish, then systematically pressure homeowners to sell through targeted harassment and fraudulent assessments. They had it all mapped out, the FBI agent explained during the final briefing. Maple Ridge was supposed to be their crown jewel, a test case for their most aggressive tactics. Targeting a deployed service member's property was meant to set a precedent they could use in other communities. The development corporation's stock had already plummeted after the initial arrests, but the release of their internal documents sent it into free fall. Shareholders filed class action lawsuits. Partners and investors scrambled to distance themselves. The company's board of directors resigned en masse when evidence emerged that they had known about and approved the illegal tactics. Trish's attempt to appeal her sentence failed spectacularly. The appeals court judge was particularly unimpressed by her argument that she had been just following corporate directives. Her brother-in-law's construction company, which had been instrumental in the scheme, filed for bankruptcy after losing their licenses in multiple states. The State Real Estate Commission launched its own investigation, reviewing every property, transaction, the development corporation had been involved with over the past 5 years. They found a pattern of fraudulent practices that led to the revocation of several real estate licenses and additional criminal charges. Former board members who had supported Trish started receiving their own legal consequences. The court found that they had breached their fiduciary duties by knowingly participating in the scheme. Their personal assets were seized to contribute to the restitution fund. "You know what's really satisfying," Jim said, as we reviewed the latest court documents. "They thought they were so clever, using HOA bylaws as a weapon. Now those same detailed records are being used to prove their crimes." The investigation expanded to the city level, where several planning department employees were found to have accepted bribes to expedite permits and overlook violations. The scandal led to a complete overhaul of the department's approval processes and the implementation of new oversight measures. Trish's personal fall was particularly dramatic. The court-ordered disclosure of her finances revealed that her wealthy lifestyle had been entirely funded by kickbacks and embezzled HOA funds. Her designer clothes, luxury car, and even her house, all purchased with stolen money, were seized and liquidated. During her first month in federal prison, she attempted to give an interview to a local news station, trying to paint herself as a victim of corporate pressure. The interview backfired when the reporter confronted her with her own emails discussing how to target vulnerable homeowners. "I have to admit," my lawyer said, reviewing the final settlement documents, "I've never seen such a complete victory. In an HOA case, they didn't just lose, their entire operation was exposed and dismantled. The development corporation's other projects across the state came under scrutiny. Other communities, emboldened by our success, began fighting back against similar schemes. The company's entire business model of predatory development through HOA manipulation was destroyed." Mrs. Chen, who had watched similar corruption in her homeland, found a certain poetic justice in the outcome. "In my country," she said, serving tea in her partially restored garden, "we say that those who dig pits for others often fall in themselves." The most satisfying part was watching the domino effect as their other schemes unraveled. Communities they had targeted in other states began filing their own lawsuits, using our case as a template. The company's legal team, overwhelmed by the flood of litigation, resigned rather than defend their actions. Their insurance carriers, citing the criminal convictions, refused to cover any of the damages. The development corporation's attempts to shield their assets through corporate restructuring were blocked by federal prosecutors who had anticipated the move. In the Marines, as explained to a reporter doing a follow-up story, we learned that victory isn't just about winning the battle, it's about securing the peace that follows. This wasn't just about stopping one corrupt HOA, it was about preventing it from happening to other communities. The final blow came when their banking partners, concerned about liability and reputation damage, began calling in loans and closing accounts. The development corporation, once valued at over $100 million, was reduced to a cautionary tale in business ethics courses. Looking through my newly restored backyard, watching the natural spring once again flowing freely, I realized that their defeat was more than just legal or financial. They had failed to understand that true community can't be manufactured through force or fraud. It has to be built on trust, respect, and genuine cooperation. 1 year after Trish's arrest, Maple Ridge Estates had transformed into something even better than its original state. The natural spring in my backyard now flowed freely through a restored wetland ecosystem that made my original pond look simple in comparison. The EPA's restoration team had outdone themselves, creating a sustainable habitat that attracted more wildlife than ever before. The morning routine that I'd missed so much had returned, but with improvements. General Quacker's descendants, I'd taken to calling them the new recruits, had established their own patrol routes around the expanded water features. The wooden dock had been rebuilt with sustainable materials, and the morning mist still rolled across the water just like before. Our new HOA was structured completely differently. Instead of concentrated power in a president's hands, we had a rotating council with built-in checks and balances. Jim had helped design the new system, incorporating principles from military organizational structure. Clear chain of command, transparent communication, and multiple redundancies, he explained during a community meeting. No single person can make unilateral decisions anymore. The new bylaws even included specific protections for deployed service members' properties. Mrs. Chen's garden had become something of a local attraction. The university's botanical department had helped her create a teaching garden, where she now hosted weekly classes on traditional Chinese horticulture and sustainable gardening practices. The soil rehabilitation had been so successful that her plants were thriving better than ever. Sometimes, she told me one evening, offering her signature dumplings, what seems like destruction can lead to new growth. Like pruning a bonsai, you cut away the old to allow the new to flourish. My workshop had evolved too. The restoration funds had allowed me to upgrade my equipment, and I'd started teaching basic woodworking classes to interested neighbors. It had become a community space where people could learn, create, and connect. Even some of the veterans groups I worked with started using it for therapeutic woodworking sessions. The community spirit that Trish had tried to manufacture through force had emerged naturally once people felt secure in their property rights. Neighbors organized voluntary cleanup days, helped each other with home repairs, and actually wanted to attend community events. Not because they were mandatory, but because they were genuinely enjoyable. The environmental improvements extended beyond my property. The Army Corps of Engineers work had revealed that our local watershed was part of a larger system, and their restoration project had improved water quality throughout the neighborhood. Native plants flourished, and wildlife returned in abundance. You've got yourself a proper ecosystem now, the EPA supervisor said during their final inspection. This is how development and nature should coexist, working with the land instead of against it. The legal precedents set by our case had far-reaching effects. The Maple Ridge Act was being adopted by other states. and property rights organizations were using our story as a template for fighting similar battles. Several veterans advocacy groups had established legal defense funds specifically for service members facing HOA disputes. Even the physical structure of our community had improved. The empty lot where Trish had planned her tennis complex had been converted into a natural park with walking trails and native plant gardens. It served as a buffer zone, protecting the restored watershed while providing recreational space that actually enhanced the environment instead of damaging it. My security cameras remained, but now they captured different scenes. Families enjoying the walking trails, children learning about nature, and wildlife returning to their natural habitat. The harsh fluorescent lights that had once illuminated the pool complex were replaced by subtle, wildlife-friendly lighting that preserved the night sky while maintaining safety. The morning runs I shared with Jim now included stops to admire the restoration progress. We'd developed a habit of having coffee on my dock afterward, sharing stories and planning community improvements. Other neighbors often joined us, turning these informal gatherings into impromptu community meetings where ideas flowed freely. "You know what this reminds me of?" Jim said one morning, watching a great blue heron stalk through the shallows. "Remember those villages we helped rebuild overseas? How they always ended up stronger than before?" I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Like those villages, our community hadn't just recovered, it had evolved. We'd learned from the experience, adapted, and built something more resilient. The property values in Maple Ridge had increased naturally, not through artificial manipulation, but because we'd created a genuinely desirable community. Real estate agents now highlighted our environmental features and strong community bonds, rather than promising resort-style amenities. Looking out over the restored landscape, I realized we'd achieved something rare. A true balance between development and nature, between individual rights and community needs. The peace I'd sought in my backyard sanctuary had expanded to encompass the entire neighborhood. The lessons learned from our battle with Trish and her development corporation went far beyond just property rights and HOA regulations. As a Marine, I'd been trained to analyze every engagement for future reference, and this civilian campaign had taught us all some valuable insights. First and foremost, we learned that the skills developed in military service translate remarkably well to civilian conflicts. The strategic planning, evidence gathering, and coordinated response that had been drilled into me during my service proved crucial in taking down a corrupt system. Jim and I often discussed how our military training had given us a unique perspective on community organization. In the Corps, they teach us to adapt and overcome, I explained to a group of veterans who'd visited to learn from our experience, but they also teach us the importance of proper intelligence gathering and coordinated action. Those same principles worked perfectly against corporate corruption. The legal system had learned important lessons too. Our case had exposed significant gaps in HOA oversight and property rights protection. The Maple Ridge Act wasn't just about protecting service members. It included provisions for all homeowners, creating new accountability measures for HOA boards and development companies. "Your case has become required reading in our property law courses," my lawyer told me during a follow-up visit. "It's a perfect example of how determined citizens can fight back against corporate overreach when they organize effectively." Mrs. Chen's experience had taught us about resilience and adaptation. Her garden, now flourishing with new varieties, alongside restored heritage plants, became a symbol of how communities can rebuild stronger after adversity. She'd started documenting her techniques, creating a manual for future generations about preserving cultural heritage through gardening. "In my homeland," she said while teaching a group of children about traditional plant cultivation, "we learn that wisdom comes from both success and failure. our community has learned from both. The environmental lessons were particularly significant. The EPA used our case to develop new guidelines for watershed protection in residential developments. The restored spring system became a model for how natural water features could be preserved and enhanced within suburban environments. Jim had taken the lessons learned and developed them into a training program for other veteran communities. "We're teaching them how to recognize the warning signs," he explained during one session. "How to document everything, build community support, and fight back effectively when their rights are threatened." The new HOA structure we'd developed became a template for other communities. The rotating council system, transparent decision-making processes, and built-in protections for homeowners' rights were being adopted by other neighborhoods looking to prevent similar abuse of power. Perhaps the most important lesson was about the true meaning of community. Trish had tried to force her vision of a luxury community through rules and regulations, but real community spirit had emerged naturally once people felt secure in their rights and respected in their homes. "You can't manufacture community spirit," I found myself explaining to a reporter doing a follow-up story. "It has to grow organically from mutual respect and shared values. Sometimes it takes a crisis to remind us of that." The experience had changed me too. My military training had taught me to fight external threats, but this battle had shown me how to defend against more subtle forms of attack. The skills I'd developed in documenting violations, building community support, and coordinating with various agencies would prove valuable in helping other veterans protect their rights. Our neighborhood had become something of a case study in community resilience. University researchers visited to study how we'd transformed from a targeted development project into a model of sustainable community living. They were particularly interested in how military veterans had played a key role in organizing the resistance and rebuilding effort. The restored spring and wetland system taught us about the importance of working with nature rather than against it. The wildlife that had returned to the area didn't just make the neighborhood more beautiful, it reminded us daily of the balance we needed to maintain between development and conservation. "In combat, you learn to read the terrain," I explained, to a group of environmental science students touring the restoration. This wasn't so different. We had to understand the natural systems we were protecting to fight effectively for them. Even the defeat of our opponents had taught us something valuable. The Development Corporation's downfall showed that no amount of legal maneuvering or corporate protection could stand against a united community armed with truth and determination. As I shared these lessons with others, fighting similar battles, I realized that our experience had created a blueprint for community action. We'd shown that ordinary citizens, when properly organized and determined, could successfully fight back against corporate greed and corruption. 2 years after Trish's attempt to seize my property, I sat on my rebuilt dock one morning, watching the sunrise over the restored wetlands. The morning mist rolled across the water just like it used to, but now it drifted through a landscape that was even more beautiful than before. General Quacker's latest batch of recruits were conducting their morning patrol, and a great blue heron stood sentinel in the shallows. The peace I'd sought when first buying this property had finally returned, but it was different now, stronger, more resilient. Like a battle-tested unit, our community had emerged from the conflict with deeper bonds and better defenses against future threats. Jim joined me for our usual morning coffee, a ritual that had become part of the neighborhood's new rhythm. "You know what I realized," he said, watching a pair of wood ducks land on the water. "Trish actually did unite the community, just not in the way she intended." He was right. The battle to protect our homes had forged connections that no HOA-mandated social events could have created. Mrs. Chen's garden classes were now a neighborhood institution. drawing people from across the city to learn about sustainable gardening and cultural heritage. My workshop had become a gathering place where neighbors worked on projects together, sharing skills and stories. The legal victory against Trish and her development corporation had ripple effects far beyond our neighborhood. The Maple Ridge Act was now protecting homeowners in multiple states, and our case had become a blueprint for fighting corporate overreach in residential communities. Veterans groups regularly consulted with us about protecting service members' property rights. Sometimes, I told a group of homeowners visiting from another embattled community, the best defense isn't just knowing your rights, it's building a community strong enough to stand together when those rights are threatened. The environmental restoration had exceeded everyone's expectations. The EPA team's final report noted that our watershed system had become a model for suburban conservation. Wildlife that hadn't been seen in the area for decades was returning, creating a living testament to what happens when development works with nature instead of against it. My security cameras still monitored the property, but now they captured different scenes. Children learning about nature from Mrs. Chen, veterans finding peace in the workshop, neighbors gathering for voluntary community events. The footage told a story not of conflict, but of a community that had found its true identity. The development corporation's luxury pool complex would have been temporary, a false amenity designed to attract buyers before they moved on to their next target. Instead, we'd created something lasting, a sustainable community based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine connection to the land we called home. As more HOA abuse cases came to light across the country, our story offered hope and practical guidance. We'd shown that determined residents could successfully fight back against corporate greed, that deployed service members didn't have to be vulnerable targets, and that communities could emerge stronger from such conflicts. "You know what's really satisfying?" Jim said one morning as we watched new plantings take root along the restored spring. They thought targeting a deployed Marine would be their easiest victory. Instead, it became their final defeat. The lessons we'd learned went beyond just HOA regulations and property rights. We'd discovered that the same principles that serve in military operations, careful planning, solid intelligence gathering, coordinated action, and unwavering determination, could be powerful tools in civilian battles. Mrs. Chen put it best during one of her garden classes. "A garden teaches us that growth requires both resistance and nurture. Our community is the same. We grew stronger because we faced the storm together." Looking out over the transformed landscape, I realized that what we'd achieved was more than just a legal victory or environmental restoration. We'd created a template for how communities could protect themselves while building something better than what they were defending. The peace I'd sought when returning from deployment hadn't just been restored, it had evolved into something more meaningful. Like the natural spring that now flowed freely through restored wetlands, our community had found its natural course, unobstructed by artificial constraints or corporate greed. For anyone facing similar battles, remember this: sometimes the best revenge isn't just winning, it's creating something your opponents never imagined possible. They wanted to build a luxury development. Instead, we built an unshakable community. They tried to exploit a deployed service member's absence. Instead, they learned why you don't mess with veterans who know how to fight back. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.